everyone, this is Nia and today I'll be painting a coconut. I did include the drawing portion of this, but unfortunately I lost the file, but I will have the outline available in my coffee shop. So let's just get right to painting. Here are the colors that I'll be using. Firstly, this is Buff Titanium by Daniel Smith, Yellow Ochre by Holbein, Quin Sienna by Daniel Smith, Sepia by Holbein, Payne's Grey Bluish by Schmincke, Sap Green by Holbein, Hansa Yellow Medium by Daniel Smith, Grey of Grey by Holbein, Graphite Grey by Daniel Smith, Moon Glow by Daniel Smith, Quin Red by Daniel Smith, and I'll also be using Bleed Proof White by Dr. P.H. Martins. This is the reference image that I roughly used to create this painting, and I'll just have it on the side as I show you the process. I'm going to start by painting the top part of the coconut where the skin has been taken off. I started with Buff Titanium here, and I'm also going to take some Yellow Ochre as well as a little bit of Quin Sienna. And I just want to mix a little bit of Yellow Ochre into the Buff Titanium firstly, and use this as a base color to paint the top section of the coconut. I want the sides to be a bit darker, so after I painted the base color, I decided to go back in and layer on a thicker consistency of the same color mixture. I want to separate the coconut shell from the meat, so I'm going to add a little bit of shadow underneath the shell, and for that I use a little bit of Quin Sienna that I already activated on my palette. Here I'm just looking for other areas of the coconut shell that I can paint using the same base color from the mixture of Buff Titanium and Yellow Ochre. While the surface is still wet, I added some of the Quin Sienna into the base color mix, and I'm just going to add lines as well as areas of imperfection to the coconut shell. So I'm just lining the sides and adding some of these colors and then softening them around the edges. And I also want to paint the inner wall of the shell using the same color mixture. I'm also going to add more Quin Sienna here, and this is just to brighten the darker value. And then I'm going to follow this up with a little bit of sepia underneath. This is to add a bit of shadow and to also separate the shell from the meat. Using the same color, I'm also going to define more of the imperfection on the coconut shell. Here I use the same mixture as the base color from Buff Titanium and Yellow Ochre, and I use this to divide the little sections where the shell has been cut out and add lines and also a darker value at the very top. Next, I'm going to paint the skin of the coconut. I'm going to create two tones of green. The first lighter green is from a mixture of Sap Green and Yellow Ochre, and for the second one I use a mix of Sap Green and Quin Sienna. I'm starting out with the light green mix, and I'm just placing them around the skin of the coconut, and at the bottom I add the darker green mix. I used a mixture of wet on wet as well as wet on dry, and it doesn't really matter because I want the skin to be quite textured, so if parts dry off or if some parts blur out, the edges doesn't really matter too much at this point. After I've covered up the whole area, I want to go back in while the surface is still slightly damp with a darker green mix. For this, I use a mix of Sap Green with Quin Sienna, and this time I added a little bit of sepia. And I'm looking at the reference image so I can see what sort of textures the coconut skin has, but I do this very loosely. I'm not trying to copy fully, but just to get the idea of the texture that it has. I personally like to add thick and thin lines as well as dots, and it's important to paint the lines following the curves or the cross contour line of the coconut in order to suggest the volume and the roundness of the subject matter. After adding the texture, the green looks a bit too earthy for my liking, so I also added some more saturated green by glazing on sap green over certain areas, and I also want to add the darker value at the bottom from a mix of sap green with a little bit of sepia. The area of the coconut skin is fairly wet, so I'm going to move on to paint the umbrella now. I use a mixture of buff titanium with Quin Red to paint the base color in a thin consistency. Then I layer on more of the same color for the details. As for the sticks or the toothpick for the umbrella, I just used yellow ochre. Throughout this whole painting, just like any other paintings that I do, I always like to go back to areas that I've already painted to increase the vibrancy of colors after they're completely dry and the colors have faded a bit, so just keep that in mind as I'll be doing a lot of this. Since the skin of the coconut is completely dry here and the textures that I've painted earlier flattened out with the base color, I use a thick consistency of a mix between sepia and Quin Sienna, and I just paint smaller, more detailed textures with a dry brush load so I can get the scratchy texture from the bristles. Next, I'm going to paint the frangipani flower. For this, I first wet the inner part of the flower with just clean water, and then I use a very thin consistency of gray just to paint that area, especially towards the middle, and just letting the paint flow. Then I go back in with a slightly thicker consistency of gray to paint on some shadows while the surface is still damp. Still working on the damp surface, I'm using a very thick consistency of Hansa yellow here to just paint the center of the flower, and then I use a clean damp brush or even a dry brush to smudge it and soften the edges until it reaches the middle portion of the flower petals. Next, I use a mixture of Quin Red with buff titanium, just like the umbrella before, and I use a thin consistency to paint the edges, and I go back in with a slightly thicker consistency right at the tip of the flower petals. I want to make the center of the flower look a bit deeper, so I use Quin Sienna right at the center, and then just like before, I soften the edges using a clean damp brush, and I also spread out more of the darker color on the sides where there's a slight fold to the petals. I want the green of the leaves to look separated from the green of the coconut, so I create a different tone of green from a mix of Sap Green and Payne's Grey Bluish. I'm only going to paint this for one side of each leaf, which are folded, and I'm going to use a different tone of green for the other side. This is just to keep the folds separated, and as for the other side, I use the same mix with added Hansa yellow. I like to also mix up the tones of greens though, so for this next one, I just use Sap Green, so you can see that this tone is much brighter compared to the rest. Here I'm going to layer on more details for the leaves after the base color is more or less dry. It doesn't really matter too much what tone of green you want to create for your painting. The main goal here is just to keep all the areas that we've drawn out separate. So I just work with whatever color I've mixed up on my palette already, and I try to paint the details following the direction of the leaf veins, but I try to paint it very loosely while leaving out some negative space for the veins. I'm going to work layer by layer, and while I wait for that to dry, I actually wanted to take off some of the paint from the right hand side of the coconut because I want that side to be a bit lighter. And once that's done, the color of the leaves have completely dry now, so I'm going back to it with a slightly darker green and try to do the same thing. I'm using a slightly thicker consistency and a lighter load here, which is why the paint is more controllable, and I try to make the detail a bit more defined as I layer on the darker colors. For the leaf with folds, I try to darken the areas which I feel would be in shadow first before adding on the details. And once the shadows are dried, then I'll go back in with the details later on. For these leaves, because the base color turned out darker than the ones on the left, I decided to just paint on the veins using my small brush instead of leaving out some negative spaces to leave some lighter colors for the veins. I want the edge of the coconut skin on the right to be more defined and more vibrant, so I can see the difference between the color of the skin and the shell. So I use Sap Green with yellow ochre, and then I soften the edges using a clean damp brush. For the coconut meat on the inside, I use a mixture of gray with graphite gray, and I'm just going to paint on the whole area inside of the coconut because it's in shadow. Here I use the thicker consistency of the same mix and paint on the bottom left corner. I'm also going to do the same thing for the bottom of the coconut lid. I'm going to use the same color mixture for the coconut meat on the side, but I use a much thinner consistency so that area will look lighter. For the sides of the coconut meat, I work layer by layer in a very thin consistency so I don't accidentally make it too dark because it's easier to add on color than to take off with watercolors. For the base color of the straw, I use a mixture of Quin Red Buff Titanium with a little bit of Hansa Yellow, but it's completely up to you what color you want to make this. You can pick out any hues, but I would suggest to use a bright or saturated color to make it look more fun. Here I ended up using more Quin Red in the mixture to make the color brighter, and I also add this on the left side because I want the left side to be slightly darker than the right. For the shadow of the coconut meat, I decided to add a hue so the gray doesn't look too dull. So here I glazed a thin consistency of Moon Glow with a tiny bit of Quin Red. For the side of the coconut shell here, I glazed a little bit of sepia with some Quin Sienna on the corners to darken it a little. At this point, I felt like I've painted most of the elements already, so I dried everything off and erased the excess pencil marks. Then I'm going to go back in to add details as well as increase the vibrancy or shadows for this painting. So I tried to look at the whole painting and see which areas I can add on to. As an example, I quite like how the coconut looks already, but I just want to increase the contrast in value, so I added a darker green at the bottom and also add additional details and some of the darker colors for texture around the coconut skin. For additional interest to the painting, I also want to add a different hue to the coconut skin, so I decided to use Quin Sienna and paint on some textures and then softening the edges so it doesn't look too distinct compared to the greens of the coconut skin. I like to also clean out some of the edges, so I sometimes use a darker version of a certain color and try to redefine the edges. So to separate the meat and the shell, I use Quin Sienna as the base color, and then I added a little bit of sepia to darken the color further. I don't want the coconut to look like it's floating, so I'm going to add a little bit of cast shadow underneath the coconut leaves and also the flower. For this, I used Moon Glow as the base color of the cast shadow. then I'm just going to use a light consistency on a wet surface so the edges will soften up naturally. To add some interest to the colors, I decided to also mix other hues into the shadow. So I'm going to add some browns from a mixture of Quin Sienna and Sepia. And I'm also going to add a little bit of green as a reflection from the coconut shell. I tried to add a darker value near the coconut shell, so I want the shadow to progress from darkest where the object is closest to the shadow and a lighter value as it moves away from the object. I'm going to add some abstract splatters for the background as well. This is completely optional, but I always like to add splatters for looser types of paintings. So I use the thin consistency of the yellow-green mix and I just smudge it around using my brush very lightly, and I also intentionally smudge a little bit of the red from the umbrella. Then I'm going to use a slightly thicker consistency of the same mix to add some splatters and also make some larger ones manually. Around the edge here, I used Moon Glow in a medium consistency and then I softened the edges. This is just to define the light edges a bit further by coloring the background instead. Lastly, I'm going to use bleed-proof white to line some of the edges of the stick as well as the highlight for the straw. And I'm also going to add a thin highlight to the coconut shell as well as the edges of the flower so the folds are a bit more visible. So that's pretty much it for this painting. I hope you guys had fun with this one. I quite enjoyed painting this loosely compared to my usual tight painting for food illustration. Like usual, all the list of tools as well as my social media links will be in my description box. If you're still here, thank you so much for watching till the end, and I'll see you at the next one. Bye!